Why Texas executes more prisoners than any state. There is a place in America where the death penalty was never just a legal sentence. It became a system, a routine, a process so established that, for years, executions could happen with the efficiency of scheduled business. While many states paused, argued, or abandoned capital punishment entirely, Texas continued. Again and again. More than any other state in modern American history. To some, that record represents justice delivered without hesitation. To others, it represents something colder, the industrial use of state power over life and death. How did Texas arrive here? Why did one state become so different from the rest of the country? Why were so many prisoners led into one execution chamber while other states grew uncertain? And inside those prison walls, what did it feel like to wait for a date that might become your last? Before we begin, subscribe and comment where you are watching from. Tonight, we trace the history of fear, politics, punishment, and power to answer one question. Why does Texas execute more prisoners than any state? To understand the Texas death penalty, you begin in Huntsville. At first glance, Huntsville is an ordinary town. Roads, homes, schools, diners, traffic lights. But for decades, it held one of the most feared addresses in America. This was where the state brought condemned prisoners to die. Executions were not carried out in a grand hall or hidden underground bunker. They happened in a controlled room inside a functioning prison. Small, sterile, quiet. The room itself was less dramatic than many imagine. Yet few places in America carried more symbolic weight. When an execution date approached, the prison changed in subtle ways. Extra coordination. Legal calls. Witness lists confirmed. Security tightened. Media gathered outside. Families traveled long distances. Staff followed checklists refined over years. Inside, another human being counted the hours. For prison employees, these were workdays. For lawyers, emergencies. For victims' families, a promised end to a painful chapter. For condemned inmates, the final stage of a sentence handed down years earlier. And for Texas, it became something else. Normal. That normalization is one of the most important reasons the state executed so often. In many places, executions remained rare enough to feel exceptional. In Huntsville, they became familiar. But the roots of that familiarity reach far deeper than the modern prison era. Texas was shaped by frontier mythology, self-reliance, violence, and harsh responses to disorder. In the 19th century, punishment across America was often immediate and public. Executions could draw crowds. Authority was displayed in plain sight. Texas inherited that broader American tradition, then layered onto it a culture that often valued toughness, deterrence, and visible consequences. As cities grew and legal institutions modernized, public hangings disappeared. Executions moved behind prison walls. The spectacle faded, but the philosophy remained. The state still believed some crimes deserved death. By the early 20th century, Texas centralized executions. Instead of counties conducting hangings, the state handled death sentences directly. This shift mattered more than it seemed. Centralization creates consistency. It creates procedure. It creates administrative habit. When punishment becomes organized, it often becomes easier to continue. Texas later adopted the electric chair. Prisoners sentenced to death were transported to Huntsville, where executions took place in a controlled setting. Decades passed this way. Then came a turning point few expected. In 1972, the U.S. South Supreme Court halted the death penalty nationwide, ruling existing systems were being applied in arbitrary ways. Across America, many believed capital punishment might be ending permanently. Texas waited. And when the door reopened, Texas was ready. The 1970s and 1980s changed America. Crime became one of the dominant public fears of the era. Violent offenses received intense media coverage. Political campaigns centered on law and order. Communities demanded stronger responses. Candidates promised certainty, control, punishment. Texas reflected that national mood, but often with sharper edges. When the death penalty returned under revised legal standards, some states moved cautiously. Others rarely used it. Texas advanced quickly through new cases, new sentencing structures, and aggressive prosecution. This was not only about crime. It was about politics. In Texas, judges are elected in many courts. Prosecutors are elected locally. Sheriffs campaign publicly. Governors face pressure from public opinion. That means criminal justice decisions exist within a political climate where appearing soft can carry consequences. A prosecutor who sought death in brutal cases could present strength. A judge reluctant to uphold severe punishments risked criticism. A governor granting clemency could face backlash. Not every official thought this way. But the environment mattered. The death penalty in Texas did not operate in a vacuum. It operated inside elections, headlines, and fear. And when public fear is high, systems of punishment often grow stronger. What came next would place Texas far ahead of the rest of the nation. The death penalty was never evenly used across Texas. Some counties pursued it aggressively. Others rarely sought it at all. This meant geography could shape destiny. One county became especially known for death sentences, Harris County, home to Houston. For years, Harris County sent more people to death row than entire states with far larger populations. That reality revealed a troubling truth. Whether a defendant faced execution could depend not only on the crime, but on where the crime happened, who prosecuted it, local political culture, and available resources. Two similar crimes in two different counties could produce very different outcomes. That unevenness troubled critics, who argued justice should not vary by zip code. Supporters responded that local communities have the right to pursue severe punishment when crimes devastate their neighborhoods. Both arguments collided in Texas courtrooms year after year. And once a death sentence was handed down, another world began. Death row. Death row in Texas was not simply prison. It was prison inside prison. Condemned inmates lived under far tighter control than most other prisoners. Many were housed alone. Movement was limited. Recreation often occurred in enclosed spaces. Contact with others was restricted. Every transfer involved restraints, escorts, searches, procedure. The architecture of death row is built around control. Cells are small, repetitive, and designed to reduce unpredictability. Time becomes the dominant force. The same walls. The same sounds. The same tray slot opening for meals. The same footsteps of officers conducting counts. Morning arrives under fluorescent light. Breakfast passes through steel. Hours stretch. Letters are read and reread. Legal paperwork is studied. Radios become companions. Silence can feel heavier than noise. Some inmates adapted through routine. Exercise in confined space. Prayer. Reading. Writing. Appeals. Others deteriorated. Years in isolation can alter perception, patience, hope, and identity. Some men entered death row young and remained there into middle age. Decades passed while the world outside changed beyond recognition. Phones became smartphones. Presidents changed. Children became adults. Parents died. Yet inside the cell, the walls remained the same. And always, somewhere in the unit, another execution date could be approaching. Waiting on death row is unlike serving a fixed sentence. A prisoner with parole hopes can measure progress. A prisoner with a release date can imagine a future. A condemned prisoner often lives between uncertainty and finality. Some dates are scheduled, then postponed. Appeals appear, then collapse. Courts request review, then deny relief. Hope rises and vanishes repeatedly. When a date becomes official, the atmosphere changes. Nearby inmates notice extra staff movement. Lawyers arrive more urgently. Phones ring longer. Guards speak more quietly. Chaplains make visits. The condemned man may receive more calls, more letters, more attention than he has in years. Then comes the final week. For some prisoners, calm emerges. For others, panic. Some proclaim innocence until the end. Some confess privately. Some focus only on seeing family one last time. Even prisoners not scheduled for execution feel the tension. They know one reality too well: if it can happen to him this week, it can happen to me later. This constant psychological pressure became part of the punishment itself. But why did Texas reach this stage so often compared to other states? The answer lies in speed. Every death sentence triggers appeals. That is because the stakes are irreversible. Appeals review trial errors, constitutional violations, hidden evidence claims, forensic problems, misconduct allegations, and attorney performance. These reviews can last years or decades. In some states, that process became so slow or contested that executions nearly stopped. Texas often moved faster. Supporters described this as efficiency. They argued endless delays denied justice to victims' families and undermined lawful verdicts. Critics described it differently. They argued speed sometimes outran fairness. Texas built legal pathways that advanced cases through state and federal review more aggressively than many jurisdictions. Combined with a large population and a high number of death sentences during peak years, the result was predictable: more cases reached the end. And when more cases reach the end, execution totals rise. Yet another factor shaped many outcomes long before appeals began: the defense lawyer. In capital cases, the quality of legal representation can determine whether a defendant lives or dies. Skilled defense teams investigate trauma histories, mental illness, intellectual disability claims, forensic weaknesses, alternative suspects, and mitigation evidence. Poorly funded or unprepared lawyers may fail to uncover critical facts. Texas, especially in earlier decades, saw serious criticism over uneven defense quality in some capital cases. Some lawyers were later accused of sleeping during trial, failing to investigate, or presenting almost no mitigating evidence. When the state is organized and the defense is weak, the imbalance can be profound. And in death penalty cases, imbalance can be fatal. Texas also changed how America executed. In 1982, Texas carried out the first lethal injection in U.S. history. The electric chair, with its visible violence and grim symbolism, gave way to a new method presented as more clinical and humane. A gurney replaced the chair. Restraints replaced leather straps. Needles replaced electricity. Language changed too. Procedures were described in medical terms. But beneath the language, the reality remained unchanged: the state was ending a life. The process inside the chamber became highly choreographed. The inmate was escorted in, secured to the gurney, and connected to intravenous lines. Witnesses entered behind glass. Final words could be spoken. Then a signal was given. Minutes later, doctors or designated officials confirmed death. To supporters, lethal injection modernized justice. To opponents, it merely hid violence behind fluorescent order. Either way, Texas now possessed a method easier for the public to tolerate than the electric chair. That mattered. Because systems often continue longer when they appear cleaner than they are. There were years when Texas executions became so frequent they no longer shocked the nation. That may be the most extraordinary part of the story. In some states, a single execution generated national debate, protests, emergency appeals, and weeks of headlines. In Texas, multiple executions in 1 year were expected. Sometimes many more. Routine changes public emotion. What once feels historic begins to feel administrative. But inside the prison, nothing about it was routine for the people involved. Guards escorted living men into the chamber. Chaplains prayed with them. Lawyers made final calls from parking lots. Families waited by phones. Victims' relatives sat behind glass carrying grief that years had not erased. Then staff finished paperwork and drove home. The hidden burden on correctional workers is rarely discussed. Even those who support the law may carry emotional weight after repeated exposure to death carried out by procedure. And yet the machine continued. Until another force began slowing it down. Doubt. Across America, wrongful convictions changed public trust in criminal justice. DNA testing exonerated prisoners once considered certainly guilty. Witnesses recanted. Forensic methods once trusted were discredited. Informants were exposed as unreliable. Hidden evidence surfaced years later. Texas faced these same storms of doubt. Several cases drew national attention and raised serious concerns about fairness, race, mental disability, or inadequate defense. Some convictions were overturned. Some sentences were reduced. Some men walked free after years lost forever. Each exoneration carried one terrifying implication: if one innocent person can be condemned, certainty itself becomes fragile. Supporters of capital punishment argued reforms could protect against error. Opponents argued no human institution can eliminate mistake, bias, or misconduct completely. That debate reached churches, universities, courtrooms, legislatures, and kitchen tables across Texas. And slowly, numbers began to fall. Executions in Texas declined from their peak era. Several reasons explain the shift. Juries increasingly used life without parole, allowing permanent imprisonment without execution. Public attitudes changed. Younger generations often viewed the death penalty less favorably. Prosecutors in some counties sought it less often. Costs of capital cases rose. Courts became more attentive to certain constitutional claims. Texas still remained the national leader in total modern executions. But the relentless pace of earlier decades slowed. Even so, the legacy remained embedded in law, politics, and memory. Because for years, no state had done it on such a scale. And that leaves one final question. What does that history mean now? Texas executed more prisoners than any other state because multiple forces aligned for decades. A culture that valued harsh punishment. Political systems responsive to fear of crime. Counties eager to seek death. Courts willing to uphold it. Administrative systems capable of carrying it out repeatedly. And a public climate that accepted it. No single reason explains the record. It was the result of many institutions moving in the same direction for a long time. The deeper lesson may be this: when enough people accept extraordinary power as ordinary, that power grows quietly. In Texas, executions became ordinary for generations. Whether history remembers that as justice or warning remains unresolved. But the chamber in Huntsville still stands. And so does the question America has never fully answered. What should the state be allowed to do in the name of justice? But to understand why the debate around Texas never truly ended, you have to look beyond statistics. Numbers can tell you how many executions took place. They can show which counties sentenced the most people to death. They can reveal the years when the pace rose, and the years when it slowed. What numbers cannot show is the emotional gravity carried by everyone pulled into the system. For the condemned prisoner, death row was not just punishment. It was prolonged anticipation. Years of appeals meant years of waking up in the same cell knowing the state still intended to end your life. Some men adjusted to the routine. Others became trapped in cycles of anxiety and despair. For families of those prisoners, life often became divided into visits, court dates, legal phone calls, and moments of fading hope. Many traveled hundreds of miles to prison units for brief conversations through glass. Some continued believing in innocence. Others accepted guilt but begged for mercy. Many simply wanted more time. For victims' families, there was another kind of waiting. Some believed execution was the only sentence proportionate to devastating crimes. They waited through appeals that stretched for years, sometimes decades, reliving the original loss whenever a hearing reopened the case. Others reached a different conclusion. Some families publicly opposed executions, saying another death could not restore what had been taken. They described the appeals process itself as another form of trauma, keeping grief active year after year. This is one reason the death penalty debate rarely settles. It involves pain on every side. And in Texas, where executions became more common than anywhere else, those competing forms of pain collided more often than in any other state. Another reason Texas led the nation was the power of juries. In capital trials, jurors are asked to make decisions unlike almost any other civic duty. They hear disturbing evidence, study violent crimes, evaluate mental state, weigh remorse, assess future danger, and ultimately choose between life and death. Texas law historically gave juries a central role in this process. Prosecutors argued that certain crimes were so severe that execution was justified. Defense lawyers tried to humanize defendants, presenting childhood abuse, trauma, mental illness, intellectual disability claims, addiction, military service, or severe neglect. Sometimes juries chose death quickly. Sometimes they deliberated for days. Sometimes one juror prevented execution entirely. That single vote could mean the difference between a death sentence and life imprisonment. Over time, attitudes changed. As life without parole became more available and widely understood, many juries grew less willing to impose death. They no longer had to choose between execution and the possibility of future release. Permanent incarceration offered another path. This shift helps explain why death sentences declined in later years. But during earlier decades, when public fear of crime was high and alternatives felt uncertain, Texas juries often chose the harshest sentence available. And those decisions shaped the state's long record. Politics also played a deeper role than many realized. Criminal justice does not exist outside public pressure. In Texas, elected officials often had to answer directly to voters about crime, punishment, and safety. A district attorney who aggressively pursued capital punishment could present that record as proof of toughness. A judge who overturned controversial convictions risked attack ads portraying leniency. A governor reviewing clemency requests knew every decision could become a headline. Even when officials acted independently, the surrounding incentives mattered. This does not mean every death sentence was political. Many cases involved brutal crimes with overwhelming evidence. But it does mean the environment rewarded severity more often than restraint. That political culture helped sustain the system long after other states became more hesitant. And once institutions adapt to a system, courts, prosecutors, prison units, appeal structures, it becomes difficult to reverse course quickly. The death penalty in Texas was never just a law. It became infrastructure. Inside prison walls, final days often followed a pattern. Condemned inmates nearing execution were typically moved under closer observation. Legal teams worked urgently through last-minute filings. Clergy members visited. Family calls became more emotional, sometimes more frequent than at any point in years. Some prisoners spent their last hours speaking calmly. Some apologized. Some maintained innocence. Some said very little. Religious faith often became central at the end. Men who had spent decades in confinement sometimes turned to prayer, scripture, or private reflection. Others rejected ritual entirely. For correctional staff, professionalism was expected. Procedures had to be followed precisely. But professionalism does not erase human weight. Repeated exposure to death, even legal, controlled, and procedural death, can leave marks that are rarely discussed publicly. The state's power depends on people willing to carry it out. That truth is often hidden behind official language. As years passed, science began reshaping old assumptions. DNA testing transformed criminal investigations and reopened closed cases nationwide. Convictions once treated as certain were challenged. Forensic methods once trusted were reconsidered. Eyewitness testimony proved less reliable than many had believed. Texas, with its large criminal justice system, was deeply affected by these national changes. Each overturned conviction did more than free one person. It raised doubts about all cases built on similar evidence. That does not mean every conviction was wrong. Many were supported by strong evidence and multiple layers of review. But the death penalty asks for something unique, irreversible certainty. And certainty is difficult to guarantee in any human system. This tension slowly changed public opinion. Some former supporters became skeptical. Some prosecutors sought death less often. Some lawmakers called for reforms. The system that once moved with confidence now faced a more cautious public. Today, Texas still carries the legacy of being America's most active death penalty state. Even when yearly totals dropped, the historical record remained far ahead of others. No modern state combined population size, sentencing culture, political support, and procedural capacity in the same way for so long. Yet the future is less certain than the past. Across the country, some states abolished capital punishment. Others kept it but rarely used it. Some juries increasingly prefer life without parole. Costs remain high. Legal challenges continue. Public opinion shifts by generation and by case. Texas stands between eras. One era saw execution as necessary proof of justice. Another asks whether permanent imprisonment can protect society without repeating cycles of death. That debate is still unfinished. Why did Texas execute more prisoners than any state? Because history made it possible. Politics made it durable. Fear made it popular. Institutions made it efficient. And time made it familiar. But familiar systems are not always permanent systems. The final judgment on this era may not come from courts or governors. It may come from future generations looking back and asking how one place became so accustomed to the ultimate punishment, and whether it should have. Some stories end with a verdict. Others leave questions behind. Texas built the most active execution system in modern America, but whether history remembers it as justice or warning is still undecided. If you found this documentary insightful, subscribe for more true crime and prison history investigations. And comment below with your thoughts on the death penalty. Until next time, the doors may close, but the stories behind them never do.